Can true crime solve criminal cases? Is the genre even ethical? And what do people think about our community? Deep dive into all of that and more. Welcome to True Crime Declassified, where we usually go behind the scenes of your favorite true crime content and creators. But today I am chatting to someone a little bit different. I'm thrilled to welcome Reece Stafferton to the podcast, someone who, full disclaimer, I am friends with outside of the pod, which makes this very formal introduction a little bit awkward. Reece is a freelance journalist and co-founder of the Great Central Gazette, the first cooperative newspaper in Leicester. They have written for the likes of The Private Eye, The Independent, and Sky News, and is incredibly passionate about independent media. So, Reece, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with your career as a journalist. Is this something you always wanted to do?
Not really. My undergraduate degree was in drama studies, so completely unrelated. And that was something I pursued when I was younger. But during my degree, I started writing a lot of opinion pieces for various small publications and became interested in journalism that way. I then did my postgraduate degree, which was in investigative journalism. And my first media job was as an intern researcher for Zinc Media, a TV production company. And I worked on a documentary called Britain's Breast Implant Scandal for Dispatches, on Channel 4.
Amazing. Oh, fantastic. And that's really why I wanted to get you on the podcast, because I wanted to get your opinion on true crime from the perspective of a journalist. So how do you feel about true crime?
Well, I used to watch BuzzFeed Unsolved.
Yes,
when
with
that first
Ryan and
came out.
Shane.
Yeah, I love that. But I guess as true crime's become more popular, I've become less excited by it. I don't watch the myriad of true crime documentaries on Netflix because they always sort of appeared quite populist, not popular, but populist in nature, for a lack of a better word. And from the sort of promo I've seen of them, most don't actually seem to be interested in investigating anything that I'm used to as an investigative journalist, and it doesn't feel like there's any solutions there. So I guess I'm a bit detached from true crime, and I'd love to see them put a bit more journalism in there.
Oh, definitely. And it's fantastic to hear that you are also a BuzzFeed Unsolved fan, or now The Watcher fan. Completely off topic, are you a Shaniac or a Bergara? Do you believe in ghosts or not? Thank goodness, I'm a Shaniac as well. I love true crime, but the moment they start talking about ghosts, I'm like, okay, I'm out. I've hit my boundary. So from your perspective then as a journalist, what would you say the relationship is like between true crime and journalism?
Well, it's like I said, it's kind of, true crime is kind of billed as investigative, but it doesn't really follow the same research practices or ethics, and it's factual TV or film, and it follows the same formula as most factual TV or film. It's probably the same with podcasts. I don't know, but at the core of it, I think investigative journalism is out there to make change, have an impact, and provide solutions, whereas true crime as it stands is there to make money, perhaps highlight an issue, and I often find they kind of sensationalize people or hot topics, as it were. So yeah, it definitely needs that more investigative edge, I think, that relates more to journalism.
Yeah, definitely. And I completely agree that there is a facet of true crime that is so obsessed with exploiting people and exploiting stories because that's what sells. And I think that's such a shame, because there's another facet of true crime that is about, fighting for justice and fighting for change, but it's often, and I'm sure it's the same with investigative journalism, that is maybe not as headline worthy. You can't pull some sort of clickbait headline from it, but in fact it is actually doing a lot of good.
Yeah, exactly that. That's what investigative journalism is. It doesn't have that clickbaitiness to it, but it's there to make an impact, and true crime should be in the same vein.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think, obviously there's very different levels of true crime. You have got the high production level Netflix true crime documentaries, and then you've got the smaller true crime podcaster who's doing it like I am from my brother's bedroom with my brother's setup, because I don't have my own setup. Do you view, as a journalist, true crime as a monolith in that, or can you identify that there are kind of different levels to this?
Yeah, there definitely is different levels to it, and I think probably more DIY podcasts and even people who are doing amateur video about true crime probably understand the ethics a bit better than the big production companies doing it, because the big production companies are out to make money, and they do have shareholders and, you know, directors and producers to appease. Whereas your average Joe doing a true crime podcast or TV show or, you know, YouTube video, they're doing it because they love it, because they're passionate about it.
Yeah.
I think we need more of that.
Yeah, definitely. And the irony is these bigger production companies and streaming services have the money and have the resources to have an entire like legal team where they look at this sort of thing. And obviously that's kind of falling short. From within the world of journalism, how do you make sure that what you do and what you investigate and report on is done with rigor and integrity?
Yeah, I could talk all day about ethics and regulation in journalism. I personally follow the National Union of Journalists Code of Conduct, and I think any true crime reader, researcher or journalist should also follow that at a minimum. There's lots of sort of different organizations in journalism that try to regulate it. So in TV and film, well, TV mainly, there's Ofcom. They do a really good job of regulating TV. I do think their remit probably needs to expand to podcasts and streaming. In print and online publishing, that's another story.
Yes.
There is no regulation, pretty much. Nobody wants to be regulated with the impress model of self-regulation that's backed by government, but it's sort of desperately needed. But I would be interested to see some of those like Ofcom models move into podcasts and streaming, and also touch on the true crime stuff as well, because it is journalism to an extent.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think anybody working on true crime should look at the NUJ's Code of Conduct and either follow it or take inspiration to create their own sort of industry guidelines.
You mentioned the differences between print media and kind of more video media. I think that's really interesting, because I always assumed, and obviously wrongly, that print media, because it is, I guess, older, because we've obviously had newspapers for around a lot longer, that the ethics behind print media would be so much more concrete. No.
Absolutely not. A few years ago, there was the Leveson inquiry, which looked at ethics in the newspaper industry and in journalism more widely. And the result of that was essentially two separate regulators being formed out of the old regulator. Wow. We now have IPSO and Impress. Impress is regulated, well, it's a self-regulatory body that is underpinned by a chartered, a royal charter. Yeah. So it's got sort of approval from the government. It follows all the recommendations of the Leveson inquiry. IPSO is sort of more your mainstream newspapers sign up to it. So the Telegraph, the Times, but that body doesn't follow the Leveson inquiry recommendations. Right. And the Leveson inquiry very much came out of the News of the World scandal with the phone hacking. Yeah. So it sought to remedy that and basically create that concrete regulation you thought was there. But Impress is definitely the better regulator, but not as many publications, or at least not as many big publications, sign up to it. It's mainly independent media that signs up to Impress.
Yeah, I think it's a shame that it almost has to get to the point of, you know, nationwide scandal for something to happen. I think it's really why anyone listening who doesn't know, I'm doing a PhD on the ethics of true crime with the hope and the intention of creating an ethical framework. I feel like true crime is getting very close to that nationwide scandal level of harm caused. We've seen with the Jeffrey Dahmer documentary and some other headlines that have come out that it's being very widely criticized. So I think it's very much getting to that point of people are starting to not view it in a good light, and for good reason, most definitely. But I'm hoping that through my research, I can kind of get in there early and equip people with the knowledge needed to hopefully not cause as much harm as they may do.
I think regulation is hard to enforce on any industry, and true crime would be the same, but there needs to be some sort of ethics standard or code of conduct at a minimum. I think every industry needs that. But true crime, I can definitely see a gap there.
So I mentioned at the start, you are the co-founder of an independent newspaper. How would you define cooperative news?
Well, the Great Central Gazette is an independent and cooperatively run newspaper that I'm helping to set up, and it's really exciting. It's based on the co-op model, often attributed to the Rochdale pioneers, and it means everyone who is a member of the business is a co-owner of the business. They get one share, one vote. There are no big corporate backers or wealthy shareholders. We're covering Leicester, and the city has its fair share of problems. We hope to use investigative journalism underpinned by the cooperative values of honesty, openness, solidarity, to uncover specific instances of wrongdoing and also hold people and companies to account.
Yeah, and you're completely right that Leicester does have its fair share of problems. I have lived here my entire life. And I think there is definitely a place for that style of newspaper that really works with the community and works with the people. And what I found really interesting when I started to think about this model of independent journalism, working with the community, being very much feet on the ground sort of newspaper, is that it may potentially lend itself more to the style of true crime or collaborating with true crime than traditional journalism that I find sometimes butts head with true crime podcasters or true crime creators, because it can be a little bit, don't take this the wrong way, journalist, a little bit gatekeepy at times. Do you think this framework could lend itself to collaborating more with true crime podcasters?
I think it would be really interesting to see a cooperatively run true crime production company.
Oh, yeah.
I think social responsibility and ethics would be valued a lot higher at such a company than a corporate production company. With the Gazette, we want to run podcasts that focus sort of on the history of Leicester. Now, if that includes some true crime, we're going to think very carefully about how our values and investigative practices can inform the final product. So yeah, generally, I would love to see a cooperatively run true crime production company. If somebody can get on that.
Or don't, and leave it to me to do it, please.
Yeah, all that.
Yeah, I'm just going to trademark it real quick. But no, I think you're completely right that it does lend itself to the style of true crime. And I always talk about true crime in two different veins. There's the big streaming company, the Netflix, even Channel 4 to an extent. And I know Channel 4, I would consider to be more ethical in the way it talks about true crime than Netflix is, but that's just my personal opinion. I would differentiate the bigger company who has the resources, has the money, and is maybe more driven by the money from the smaller podcaster, researcher, creator who is doing it for the love of it. And I think that more collaborative framework would work so well with these smaller true crime podcasters. And I always describe these smaller true crime podcasts as the real backbone of the genre. And I really don't want to detract from the influence they have had on the genre, but I think it's a really exciting approach to true crime, to consider it as something that could be a vehicle for discussing issues within the community that link to crime and law and previous criminal cases. I just think it's really interesting.
To pick you up on the Channel 4 point, they would seem more ethical because they sort of are. They're regulated by Ofcom. They have to adhere to a strict set of rules. Ofcom has some of the strictest regulations out of any of the regulators, really. And I know what you mean about sort of the small scale true crime podcasters and content creators. I mean, we have a similar thing in journalism. We call it citizen journalism. It's your average everyday person going out and telling stories. And I can see a lot of crossover there between citizen journalism and sort of DIY true crime podcasts.
Yeah, definitely, especially when we think about web sleuths and how web sleuths are often considered within the world of true crime. But I think you're right in saying that they may be considered more sort of citizen journalists. Would you consider yourself someone who started out as a citizen journalist and then became more sort of independent journalist? Like, where would you position yourself within the sort of hierarchy of journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I was quite politically motivated at university. I don't know anyone who wasn't,
Yes.
but I would guess, yeah, I did start out as a citizen journalist, really, and then I took formal training, and then firmly placed myself within investigative journalism, because that was the sort of journalism I loved reading, the long form, sort of holding people to account rather than sensationalist clickbait that you see in the Sun or the Daily Mail. And I've moved more into community local journalism now, because I think they're vastly underreported.
And how accessible would you consider the training required to be an ethical or integrity driven journalist?
I think all documentary makers, whether they're podcasters, TV producers, film directors, whoever, they should take an investigative journalism course.
Right.
And I might be a bit biased in saying that, but it will actually help them make a difference. I mean, imagine a cross between Channel 4's Dispatches and your favorite Netflix true crime documentary. That could be powerful. There is a cost of getting in there, but one of the things we want to do with the Gazette is bring that training to local people. So whether it's how to write a freedom of information request, whether it's how to start your own podcast, how do you read a company's finances and accounts, those are the skills we think people need to know if they're going to start to become citizen journalists, or even if they want to move into documentary making. If they're in true crime, I think they definitely should take that kind of training as well.
My dad just walked in and completely distracted me. How fantastic. No, it's all right. Just recording a podcast, whatever. See, this is it. This is the real raw in your brother's bedroom recording a podcast. You don't get this sort of production value at Netflix.
Couldn't ask for any better.
I know, exactly. And then Reece has got a wonderful Halloween mug right now.
That's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And I think this part of it, the human part of true crime, is what makes it so enjoyable for people, that it is just the average Joe sat at a microphone telling a story, talking to people who interest them. And I wanted to pick up on what you mentioned about the training, because I think that is really, really exciting. If someone wants to become a podcaster, someone wants to enter the world of true crime and discuss criminal cases with the same rigor and integrity as journalists, what advice do you have for them?
Well, I'm not saying investigative journalists can solve these crimes. If it's an unsolved crime, for instance, that's not our job. We can come up with solutions, but not a solution, if that makes sense. I think, like I've said already, train as investigative journalists, or at least learn some of their skills. It will enrich both your work and help you keep yourself socially responsible and your work socially responsible. Obviously, there's a whole load of skills you need to learn as a podcaster, production wise, but dedicate some time to learning how to research ethically and responsibly, and I think you'll go a long way.
And then from your perspective as a journalist, as we look towards the future and obviously reflecting on the recent headlines that have come out about true crime, what would you say are the biggest issues that the true crime genre may face in the future?
It's definitely that ethics challenge. I think there's going to be, whether it's a podcast or a documentary, 5-10 years down the line, that does something completely outrageous. Now, that could be phone hacking, like News of the World. That could be violating somebody's privacy and borderline harassment, whatever it is, I think it's going to bring true crime to its knees, and the industry is going to have a serious self-reflection, like journalism has had to have, and journalism is still having. So I think moving forward, just any true crime podcaster, be wary, it's coming, be prepared.
And do you believe, because obviously within true crime, a lot of podcasters, a lot of documentary filmmakers, they're trying to tell a story. So as a journalist, do you allow yourself to have an opinion on the stories that you tell? Where do you fit within the report that you're giving?
I think journalists need to have objectivity rather than an opinion. So obviously everyone holds their own personal political beliefs, or whatever belief it is. That shouldn't impact the story you're reporting on. Now, obviously, if somebody's committed heinous crime, have an opinion, be objective about it and report on it in a way that shows how horrendous that crime is.
Yeah.
But if you're starting to, I don't know, say you're a devout Marxist and you're starting to rationalize everything within a story in the lens of kind of like left-wing politics, I think you're touching on dangerous territory there, where you start losing the trust of the reader. But if you've got general objectivity, that's sort of your core value that you need to hold. I don't think things like impartiality work too well. That's something Ofcom regulates quite strictly. But time and time again, we see people criticizing impartiality and never really criticizing objectivity.
Okay, and could we talk a bit more about then the difference between the two? Because I'll admit it's not something I have a huge amount of knowledge on.
Yeah, impartiality would be sort of creating a balance and remaining neutral in any story. So, for instance, one thing broadcasters do is if they're hosting I don't know, a political panel talking about policy or an election or whatever, they'll have somebody from the Labour Party and somebody from the Conservatives on that panel, or they'll give equal airtime to both or whatever. That doesn't work because you can't regulate what they're saying. You know, there's an element of free speech. Everybody should be able to say what they believe. But if somebody on that panel suddenly comes out with, I don't know, Nazi rhetoric, you're going to want to shut them down, and you have to be objective about that. You can't give everybody freedom of consequence, and objectivity is about that. It's about giving freedom of speech, but not freedom of consequence.
Absolutely, I'm so on board with this approach. I think it's something that some true crime podcasters do so well in that and oftentimes it's true crime podcasters who either have a background in journalism, because that's another thing we'll find, that journalists are starting to move into true crime, which is really interesting, or they have paid closer attention to the ethics. But you'll be talking about a criminal case, and maybe there's a lot of racism or sexism and homophobia rooted within the criminal case, and being able to say, in the nicest words possible, because it makes me want to swear, that sucks and shouldn't be happening and it's wrong. And I think it's important to continue having and making that stance very clear that human rights is not a discussion and it's not a debate. It's something that should be granted to all of us. So I'm so glad to hear that that is also a standard within journalism.
That's exactly it, really. You've just hit the nail on the head with objectivity. If your reporting is underpinned by the facts and the belief that human rights are not negotiable, that's what objectivity is, really. I think impartiality gives a bit of leeway on that, and then you start moving into dangerous territory. But objectivity is sort of the protection of human rights, really, at its core.
Yeah, definitely. And then just going off that to kind of define ethics within true crime, I nearly went really Leicester then and said ethics. Love it. I think when I've had conversations with people before about ethics in true crime, I've sort of experienced some pushback and people saying, well, why are you limiting freedom of speech? Why are you limiting people's ability to talk about what they want to talk about? And I think that's not it at all, because people should still be able to say when people be racist. I think it's more about saying, no, you can't follow someone after they've finished their shift at work with a microphone and demand that they make comment on a 10-year-old cold case. And, you can't speculate that someone had an affair with one of their students just because you think it may be possible. And I think that's where ethics in true crime really comes to a head. How would you define the Great Central Gazette in 3 words?
Not for profit.
Oh, that's good. That's good. That you've practiced that.
I've had to say it enough.
Yeah, this is it. It came to you immediately. You were just like, not for profit. I know this. I know this script. What would you say are your top 3 sort of newspaper publications that you go to, or even, top 2, top 1? It may not even be 3.
The Guardian.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who doesn't like the Guardian? Bristol Cable, because they are an absolute inspiration to what we're doing at the Gazette.
Mm-hmm.
And then probably, I quite like the work the Ferret does in Scotland. And I will give an honourable mention as well to Open Democracy, because their sort of long form analysis and bringing together journalists, academics and activists, I think that kind of model works really well. And I love reading their stuff.
Brilliant. I love the idea of journalism really holding on to the more long form articles. I don't like the clickbaity 500-word online pieces that they just shill out as fast as possible. So it's great to have a shout out to that, to more long form journalism. If anyone's looking for, or if anyone's excited about or is interested in cooperative news, what should they expect from the Great Central Gazette?
We're doing things differently. We're not going to just be publishing journalism. We're going to be engaging the community in Leicester at every point in the process, before a story, during a story, and after a story. That's what makes us different to your regular legacy media, your mainstream news. I think that's needed. People have gone too long without being part of the news cycle. Rather than just they just digest it, they read it, they move on with their day. I think giving people a sense of ownership over their news can not only help us investigate things better, because we're getting more tip-offs, people are giving us leads, but also it helps us come together and have a conversation, honest conversations about what needs to change locally in the city for the better. And those conversations aren't really happening at the moment. I think there's a lot of selfish talk when people talk about solutions in Leicester. It's often, what can I get out of this? How is this going to make me look good? It shouldn't be about that. And the Gazette is going to challenge that.
Amazing. And for any true crime podcasters or creators out there, everything Reece just said, just channel that into whatever you do, because that is such a core of I think what good journalism is. So before we wrap up today, could you please share your social media handles? And I know the Great Central Gazette has got a crowdfunder out at the minute, so if you could just promo that as well, that'd be grand.
Yes, you can follow me at Journo Reece on Twitter. You can also visit our crowdfunder for the Great Central Gazette at greatcentralgazette.org/crowdfunder.
Well, Reece, my lovely friend, it was such a pleasure to have you on the pod. Thank you so much for giving your insight and your perspective as a journalist. I think it's so important to work with the journalism industry and to work with journalists in true crime. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I've loved it.
Thank you for listening to True Crime Declassified. I'm Meg and I have been your host today. You can find me on Instagram at True Crime Declassified, or my PhD Instagram is at Megan Lupton Writes, where I talk a little bit more about my project into the ethics of true crime. If you want to be on the podcast, email me at truecrimedeclassified@gmail.com. I would love to talk to you if you are a journalist, investigator, true crime fan, or podcaster, documentary filmmaker. If you love true crime, come and be on the show.